Hello everyone. This is going to be up slightly earlier than it normally is, mostly because I have a lot of meetings on Wednesday afternoon, so hopefully this should be up before then. I hope you're all well, and I'll be starting the session soon. Same kind of thing that we always do. I take you through the slides. This session in particular looking at the theory, and on the Wednesday session 2 weeks from now, we'll be looking a lot more at doing activities around those, drilling that knowledge and consolidating that knowledge and looking at the practical applications for it. This is just to get you kind of used to the material and introduce it to, and also give you a good kind of knowledge bank of theorists and theories generally related to gaming culture. So I'm going to start sharing. Hopefully this works. My computer's been a little slow today, which I'm sure you're all used to by now. Share screen. Here we go. Slideshow from beginning. Sorry, I'll just give everything a second to load. Yeah, it's getting there we go. So this session is very much around the idea of marginalisation of the gamers, looking in particular concepts of what we mean by marginalisation and also power dynamics within the gaming community. Communities, of course, being what we've looked at, where people come and connect, the places they make their own, the way that they connect to each other. And from that, we're developing that knowledge to look at hierarchies and how people operate within them. And if these communities have hierarchies, or if everything's equitable, or how gaming and where the gaming community itself fits within wider society. Is it nice and comfortably fit? Is it pushed to the outskirts for lots of different reasons? Change of slide in theory. There we go. This session, we'll be looking in particular at the struggle for acceptance of games as a medium. We've touched upon this a little. We looked at some Senate hearings in the 2 weeks prior to this, looking at how games are treated as violent, why they are, but we're also going to look at them as accepted as a valid product and valid within game studies communities, and why we still have these hang-ups and how they still kind of operate in 2023. We'll be looking at gamers and /gaming, and that as a general identity and the collective bonds that we form, which is basically underpinning all of our work, that idea of community, gaming, and because that through communities, through the sharing of knowledge, research, communications, even the sharing of fun, constitutes awards, creating cultural products and cultural moments. And that is what we are concerned with. It is culture, and it's all the things that make up culture. In particular as well, we're going to have looking at how gamers get caught up in media storms, partly showing how gamers influence culture by their behaviour and how they're held to the standard of role models, but also how quickly culture will turn upon gamers, and this idea of, are they really accepted in the community and in culture at large if with the second that they have a misstep, they're kind of tossed on the pile and discarded. So how accepted, or is gaming in such a precarious position within culture that we feel that we have to, be absolutely vigilant with what is happening in this world. Games at the margins, this was taken from the Senate hearings that I showed clips of, which should be, you can all access via Canvas. If you weren't in the session, please have a look at it. The whole hearing is very long. You don't have to necessarily watch all of that. However, do look at what they say overall with their views. Watch for a good half hour or so. You'll get the gist of their arguments. And please look at your key and extended readings around games and culture. And have a look as well. A good activity is to look at any protests at the minute about video games, or WHO, World Health Organization classifications of which games are addictive. Those are some good, little additional readings that you could do. Generally, the threats to the idea of games being accepted as a form of culture have stemmed from politics, so the world of politics and legislators, those who write the laws, whether games can be accepted as culture or not, whether games can be accepted and sold to the public or not, or whether they will have to be regulated in some way. One of the things that we looked at was very much like films, when games were criticised for their violence and their themes that they depicted. One of the things that happened with games is that a rating system was brought in, so children couldn't buy certain games if they were rated, say, 15. They needed to be accompanied by a parent with some of them. Parental guardians being advised with films, in it almost similar with games, although it tends to be slightly stricter, because it's assumed that the child will play the game alone. So that's an extra consideration. So politics have really filtered into this. Sometimes as well, games are supported by politics. So a lot of war games are advised upon by police and military experts who won't make the likeness of the guns. This somehow will then get tacit support from those industries, which then filters back to politicians. Even though we're worried about gun violence, it's a contradictory explanation. It tends to be linked to different stakeholders, which I know that you've been talking about in other modules. You also have games which have been used by the military in particular, almost as simulated games. This is a way to develop technology, but also to train people and to get them basically used to the military, the tools that they'll be using, and it's a form of almost assimilation into a culture before you even joined it. So while we do talk about like the political marginalisation of games, sometimes the political sphere and industry sphere has tried to bring it in more into the mainstream for other ends. We've had moral campaigns. This is certain video games, ideas of violence, ideas of creating a moral degeneracy, and ideas of video games affecting the moral well-being of society. One campaigner related to TV, whose arguments generally have all been applied to video games, was Mary Whitehouse, in particular during the golden era of television, was trying to limit content for what children could see, and often you'll hear the reference of moral campaigns being related to a Mary Whitehouse activity, even if she has no involvement, ever had any involvement, because that she was kind of the trailblazer for moral campaigns, which is a little bit TV studies fact, but is relevant to video games. So if you ever want to look into how moral campaigns are have been carried out, please look at basically the life of Mary Whitehouse. A very common occurrence was think of the children and what they're being exposed to, and this is kind of the basic fundamental argument for the children, really, that they shouldn't be exposed to certain types of video games, and video game content should be limited. Threats have also stemmed from preservation. You may have seen in the news, but a vast majority of older games, and I'm talking like PS1, PS2, even before that, Sega Dreamcast games, are under threat. Many are unplayable. Many have just been lost. This is because companies go under. The console wars, basically only Sony, Nintendo, and Xbox really survived. That a lot of them are no more, or at least are very limited, or maybe in different spheres now. And even current providers such as Sony haven't put the effort or the finances in to preserve their old games. So what we're losing is old systems and games that only play on certain systems, games that aren't produced anymore. And as technology advances, it makes it less compatible with the older material. So what we're losing is a huge amount of culture, which is a massive issue. And I will be putting more on Canvas about this issue for you to read up on, because it's one of the greatest threats to gaming culture, and understanding it's very difficult for game scholars in particular, because if we're trying to write about the history of games, if we're trying to understand games as an art form, as a medium, as an act of consumerism, we have to understand its history. And if we don't have access to it, we can't do it. And we don't know what game history is. So it's a really sad but huge threat that's facing the video games industry. There's also academic competition for resources, which we've talked about a little bit in the first session, ludology and narratology. Please look at your slides on this. to brush up on them. Ludologists believing that games should be looked at in their own right, narratologists believing that stories should be looked at. Never the twain shall meet until very recently. But those different threats, those different they saw each other as different threats, so they were all competing for academic funding within each other. But it was the same funding stream, but it could only go one of two ways. And then you also had the threat from more established art forms or forms of study such as film and TV and radio. So there was a huge competition for resources. But generally as well, if to establish something as culture, it needs to be observable, it needs to be studied, and it needs to be investigated, because how can we talk about culture if we can't do that academic research around it? So generally, one of the biggest threats to cultural artifacts will start with academic faculties or projects or research projects not getting the funding that they need, and that's how things kind of get lost and forgotten throughout history. RSF, who we talked about a bit in previous sessions, he's a big media scholar. Please if you see a text basically with him in the library, there are many at Prospect. Please read what he says. He's fantastic. Oh, and Ludotopia is in the library as well, so please read that. Sorry, I've got a bit of a dry throat today. I've done a lot of lectures. But RSF said 2001 that the greatest challenge to computer game studies will no doubt come from the academic world, that making room for a new field usually means reducing the resources of the existing ones, and the existing fields will also often respond by trying to contain the new field as a subfield. Games are not kind of cinema or literature, but colonising attempts from both of these fields have already happened, and no doubt will happen again and again until computer game studies emerges as a clear self-sustained academic field. So because it was new, we didn't know how to talk about games, so we obviously used the tools that we had, film and TV studies. This is where the narratology approach came into it, and it will keep happening until games becomes its own substantiated field. And that takes a long process of developing time, developing money, developing grant funding. And this is a big part of culture. It's getting the justification to study something. And because games they're not new anymore, but in terms of cinema and TV, what they're often compared to, they still feel quite new. It means that we have creative freedom to try and look at them under different ways and with different methodologies. And this is really exciting for, assignments, assessments, research projects. You can look at them in many different ways that you want, because who's to say that we can't? As we said at the very beginning of the esports degree, we're starting something new and we're figuring it all out together. So who's to say that you can't look at things in a new and exciting way? It's difficult for game studies because it's trying generally to get more attention in the community of academia, but also in terms of consciousness of how much funding the games industry needs. But while there are challenges with that, which we've talked about, which we'll look at over the weeks to come, it's also an exciting time where people can be creative and try and work and get attention for games in a new way, certainly within the media industry. So we talked at the start about power dynamics and also kind of the fights among TV, film, game studies within universities, but also within the entertainment industry. And that's because when there's a competition for recognition and or resources, it's common for a hierarchy to emerge. TV and film have long held a grudging relationship. For example, they were joined forces to be old established media that warrant study in comparison to games, but actually TV and film studies have been fighting for many, many years over who's the most valid and which is having their golden age. Although I think we can all agree that films are not having their golden age currently, still struggling after COVID. Science fiction as well has established its own hierarchy. While everyone who is involved in science fiction from a media industry perspective or a game studies perspective or an academic, whatever, they all love science fiction, it's great. There has traditionally been a hierarchy with hard science seen as more legitimate, focusing on physics, electronics, chemistry, astronomy, and soft science being basically sociology and biology in particular, sometimes psychology as well. And hard and soft were donated as different skill sets, basically, and different knowledge bases, with hard being seen as more masculine and more academically rigorous, and the softer being seen as easier to get into. For a long time, a lot of soft science fiction authors, including Margaret Atwood, did not call themselves science fiction because they didn't feel that there was a place for them. We've seen this as well, even in communities. We see gatekeeping quite a lot. Are you a real fan if you can name 50 Cyberpunk 2077 characters? What this is actually trying to do is just to establish a hierarchy. It's not just everyone coming together. Unfortunately, those communities very rarely stay static with everyone happy. What often emerges is competitions for resources, competitions for status of who is the best fan and who knows the most. I have seen a typo, which I get to adjust because this is my session. But also, as you may have noticed, we go from current slide. As you may have noticed, I have that many PowerPoints. They actually don't pick up typos anymore. There was no red line there. Sometimes they do, but a lot of the time, everything gets overwhelmed and exhausted, which is highly relatable. But it doesn't always pick up, so apologies for typos. I do try and edit them out where possible. Are there any splits within the games industry about games which are perceived as serious versus casual? We're going to look and find and discuss examples of this. Next, we're going to be looking at gamer identity. Hostility and tension arises in particular when identities are threatened, but how are these identities formed and why do people become fans? This is an activity you'll work on and be thinking about. Just what connects people? Is it memory? Is it nostalgia? Is it just love? Is it passion? Are they looking for something to fulfill their social lives? We'll be looking at all these different examples. Just give you a minute though, as I always do, give you 30 seconds just to think. Right, perfect. The origins of fandom. Sorry, I'm just going to move myself so I can see my own writing. So Theodore Adorno stated that fans enthusiastically advertise to infect those around them. It's a contagion-based argument. By contagion, we mean that it spreads. There's an example of a virus here. I believe it's COVID, actually. Sorry for the flashbacks. But that's not the word contagion actually originally didn't have as Vint wrote about this, Cheryl Vint, didn't have a huge connotation with disease initially. It was more contagious. A contagion was an idea that rapidly spreads, and fans operate in that way because they want to get every other fan enthusiastic about the same thing that they are. Pierre Bourdieu argued that taste was defined by social systems and not solely personal choice, meaning that many people may use taste to separate themselves from those they are closest to. For instance, they may want to make their love of some esoteric video game kind of a social status thing. They like this really difficult game that no one else has played, and they get the satisfaction of knowing that they feel like they've achieved something that no one else can. Bourdieu further argued that people acquire social capital and that people claim their place in society by gaining knowledge that reflects their social position. As people seek to define their social space, people learn predispositions habitus. So as we learn and get knowledge over our kind of likes and our likes, it positions us socially. And within fandoms, we get even more of a social hierarchy because we're specifically competing over the same bits of knowledge. We're not differentiating necessarily ourselves from our peers or our family or friends, but we are trying to establish our own hierarchy within a fandom against people who have the same likes and dislikes. Fans. Jenkins, again, another big name. All his main books are in the Prospect Library, and he has a really great book on understanding fandom, which where a lot of the references for this session are going to come from. So please do read that book. Fans have always been early adapters to new media technologies. Their fascination with fictional universes often inspires new forms of cultural productions, ranging from costumes to fanzine to now digital cinema. Fans are the most active segment of the media audience, one that simply refuses to simply accept what they are given, but rather insists on the right to become full participants. He further argued a couple of pages later that within convergence culture, everyone's a participant, although participants may have different degrees of status and influence. Participation, is shaped by the cultural and social protocols. We're going to be looking at participation culture quite a lot generally over the course of this semester, and how it contributes to creating culture, and what we mean by participatory culture and participatory communities. Fans, of course, having to adapt to new media technologies all the time. Fans were the first to make use of live journal products and fan fiction to really try and get other people to read their works and to get more people excited about specific ships in particular, almost as a political tool, to try and campaign for certain authors to go down ships that they supported, and also using social media to backlash and complain if producers did not do that. Fans become this active segment of the audience because they don't just want to accept, they want to see a democratic kind of process where their needs, their wants are listened to, even if that includes things, again, just to use the example, favourite ship. So what happens then is that there becomes an unsteady and unbalanced and sometimes a tense relationship between the creator of the thing, who up until the point it's read and loved or played and loved, is the full commanding owner of it. But then to keep selling, to keep people happy, they may face the decision of whether to acquiesce to what fans want and whether to keep fans happy. And so fans are negotiating all the time to try and get the content that they want, thus creating a new dynamic. And this is how fans in particular have made use of new technologies, because previously they didn't have the voices to be able to do this. They didn't have the outlets, but everything from podcasts, fan fiction, Twitter, or X as it's now known, even Blue Sky's taking off all this, the way that video blogging took off, all of those modes, all of those platforms, they're the platforms, of course Tumblr, they're the platforms that fans really utilize for their own purposes. So for Ying in particular, who looked at why did gamers want a game? Why are they fans in the first place? He did a survey in particular of 3,000 MMO players, massively multiplayer online games, and found that there are 3 categories of player motivation, which are achievement, that can be personal sense of self, it can also be rewards and game rewards, currencies, PlayStation trophies, things like that. Socialization, either lived lives through NPCs or connecting with other people online, and immersion, the feeling of living those fictional lives, which we talked about in relation to Guy earlier, about 2 sessions ago now. So this is a discussion point that we'll look at, and I want you to find some examples of games in particular, although there are some very obvious TV shows that also link into this. And this is something that I want you to kind of bullet point for a few minutes, and then we discuss as we always do, but I like to give you time to get some statistics, to get some understanding and develop a little bit of a case study. So I'll leave this on the screen for a minute. But what we'll be looking at is how have opinions over failed games changed? By failed games, we mean having an unsuccessful launch at first, or were critically not credited. Some examples for you, if you want to get some like stats and to look at in advance, are the launch of Cyberpunk 2077 and No Man's Sky. Has social media helped or hindered game sales? And I'm going to leave this up just for another 40 seconds, just for you to kind of think about, or for you to jot down avenues that you kind of want to explore. There we go. Again, I'm going to leave this up again for us to look at. We've already looked at this a little bit, but I want you to think about the case studies that you've just picked, whatever game it is, which is, how did fans organise? Did they help make it better or worse? And how did the fans connect with one another? Again, I will leave this up for about 30 seconds this time. Brilliant. From these general kind of hierarchies that we get, or if anything in life is quite general, we get splinters, subs. We've talked a little bit about subcultures. We also get subgroup structures. And part of the way that you do this, so you may get die-hard players. So of Destiny, you may get people who just connect with Warlock, and that's all that they do. This is how that they connect or do that. They find a specific thing about a specific like that they want. This is one way that group structures are not just up and down, but they splinter left, right, and all over the place. So it's important to have that in mind. Bond also said that when a new group forms, the group feels compelled to distinguish itself from others. And for sports fans, and sports being useful because esports, this means wearing kits and merchandise as a uniform. I want you to think about what some positives and negatives are of this on group behaviours and also fandom, the individual, if they're having to spend that money. But I also want you to think about how gamers in particular will do this. Again, I'll leave it up for 15 seconds. Foucault in particular, so a few sessions are going out. It's weird for me to do the online lessons, I'm sorry. It was last session in person, but by the time that you should be up to this video, it will be 2 sessions ago. And we looked at we did a very quick look at Marx and Gramsci, so I like to introduce the philosophers, the main philosophers, just so you get an understanding of them, because generally throughout your degree you'll be coming up against these big names every so often getting cited. Foucault is the theme of it today. He's the man today. Foucault generally was concerned with the management of life. He was a sociologist. He documented changes from archaeology structures, prisons, the move from clinics to hospitals, to hospices. He looked at surveillance and how basically he took a broad overview of society, and he looked at all the different communities and all the different populations and how they were managed. He was slightly different to Marx, who purely focused on capitalism and the economy as a form of study, and he focused on the management of life. Not to say capitalism doesn't come into that, because of course it does, because the income, the wealth that we have access to depends on where we live, where we can send our kids to school, etc., etc. But he was more concerned with a broad overview of life. And Foucault looked at identity roles in particular and argued that knowledge of humans is a form of power that categorizes the individual, marks him by his own individuality, attaches him to his own identity, imposes a law of truth on him, which he must recognize and which others have to recognize on him. This is how identity, and the gamer identity in particular, sets us apart. It is the way that we categorize ourselves and organize ourselves. For instance, you are categorized in life by the degree option that you have chosen. I mean, the choice to go to university as well indicates a certain measure about your life and the expectations of it. And it also suggests how academically inclined you are. But then the choice of degree filters you again, and that also filters you with the peers that you'll connect to, and it is how you'll be identified in life. So there's a discussion. Again, I'll leave it up for a minute. Which do you think is the most loved sports team in the world? You can pick any sport at all. It doesn't have to be sport. I want you to look at their history and their business model. Tell me, though, who supports this team and why? What's the appeal? Is it a local team? Is it a global brand? If it is a global brand, what type of people are attracting? Is it the middle class? Is it Inter Miami that's selling tickets for like £600 just because they want to see Messi and it's like a celebrity cult thing? Look, do a case study. That's what I want from this. So I'm just going to leave this up again another 30 seconds for you to think and get ideas. So group identity and how it's formed. Again, looking at how communities are formed and how we're accepted and whether it's at the margins. So Levine conducted a study, 45 Manchester United fans in the study, and this was to test empathy, basically. He sent them on a walk across the campus where he arranged for a jogger to fall over in plain sight, and the jogger for the different groups wore either a Man United shirt, Liverpool shirt, for context for any students who don't know, it's the most hated rivals of Man United, or just a plain t-shirt, no football branding at all. The researchers wanted to know if the shirt choice of the jogger impacted whether they would offer to help the jogger. And it was found that they were 3 times more likely to come to the jogger's aid when he was wearing the Manchester United shirt. Levine then recruited a new set of United fans, and before the study took part, the runner happened. He got them together and he encouraged them to think of the love of the sport above any love of a particular club. So it doesn't matter like who you support, you just love football. That's what we're all here for, and we're connected by that. After this, they then proved equally willing to help the jogger if he wore a Liverpool shirt. The previous briefing expanding their participants' social identity. They weren't just identified by Man United and Liverpool fans, they were identified as being fans of football. And this showed because almost nobody helped the jogger in a plain shirt. So while you may have a specific group or a specific community, you are empowered by this community and you connect, and sometimes you can connect to the wider community if there is a like, but if there is no common interest, it creates a disconnect. So interestingly, football is generally, not everyone will support football, is a specific group in society, but in this instance it was empowered and had more people around them, whereas the jogger, who was just a member of society and had no tethers into one category to thus marginalise him, and yet he was left in a more vulnerable position for that because nobody helped him in the plain shirt. Sports as well can be places of political expression. They can be at the front and centre of politics, and sometimes that means that they're on the margins. One case study of this is how Barcelona and Real Madrid have the biggest rivalry in football. It gets more watches every single year, their matches, than the Super Bowl. It's not a derby because they're not local rivals, but the atmosphere is akin to that bit of rivalry. This is back due to the Spanish Civil War, with Madrid being the central home of fascism, and their stadium being named after a prominent fascist, the Bernabeu. And Catalonia, which is a specific region or sub-nation within Spain and believes and has argued long for independence, faced during the Civil War, faced its language being banned and heavy bombardment. During one game against Madrid, Barcelona were roundly defeated because they were too scared to actually kick the ball and play football. This was during the war, and those tensions still exist. This means that there's a rooted and connected social identity, and I want you to think about whether esports can have that, because it is so new and there's not that historic connectedness. Professor Stephen Reicher at the University of St. argued that we seek to make ourselves distinctive because the group is a source of meaning, of understanding. It's a way of positioning ourselves in the world, but you can differentiate yourself by being kinder to others, by being more generous or whatever. You don't have to do it by being stronger, by doing the other down, which is an important thing to remember when we start to look at in the upcoming weeks on the toxicity of the gaming world and esports. Again, referring social bonds, Bond, ironically, said that diehard fans never abandon their team. So how do they restore their shattered self-esteem? They take the only option available to them. They dig in, reaffirm their loyalty, draw ever closer to their group, sling obscenities at opposing fans, and remind each other that suffering breeds resilience, which is how they build communities, but it's also how they can marginalize themselves because they're positioning themselves further away. They are positioning us versus the other. However, because their group or their specific like in society is so marginal and so small, so specific, actually they are othering themselves because they're moving away from wider society. Newson and surveys found between a 10-year period between 2003 and 2013 found that the least successful Premier League team, Hull, at this time had a fandom that reported the greatest number of social ties and the greatest measure of kinship. And again, we need to think about this because football has a unique model where each team is tied to an area. And while a lot of teams, not all, but a lot of teams will buy in players from different places, they will have local academies with homegrown talents. This isn't always the case. If you look at Man City, very few grew up as a Man City fan. I think there was an article in The Athletic that found that Newcastle United had the most boyhood fans playing for their club. You have clubs like Athletic Club, formerly known as Athletic Bilbao, who will only recruit Basque players because that's where the club is from. There are different levels then of connectedness to an area and therefore connectedness to a community. Remember, places make meaning, which is what we're looking at this week. Well, last week in person. This week because it's tomorrow. It's confusing, go with it. Places make meaning, and that's how we connect to them. Can esports do that? They're named after a place, but often they don't go to that place. A team will be named after that place, but they won't often train there. They won't often have any connections there. Does it matter? Is it about the local economy? Does a foreign football, or does a football team, Real Madrid, hiring mostly Galacticos rather than Spanish players? Does that matter? Does that connect? Does that change or disrupt their identity as a Spanish team? In particular, in contrast to Barcelona. How much does it matter, and how does esports build those connections and build up that fandom? Those are questions that we will be looking at. Just a general vague question, which is somewhat scary, which is what would you give up for your team? One surveyed baseball fans and asked what they would consider doing if it guaranteed their team a title victory. More than half claimed they would give up sex, sweets and all drinks, but water for a month. 20% were willing to wear the same underwear or give up talking to their best friend. Imagine giving up talking to your best friend. I would question if they were best friends at all. When one asked what fans would consider, at least minimally consider, around 50% said they would consider organ donation. That's quite a huge amount. And I'm going to say, because we're all esports fans, are all interested in gaming, and assuming that like you have an interest in sports generally, please do not give up a kidney. If you give up any organs, you will need medication for the rest of your life. It is not that simple. Please don't do it. Murdoch in particular looks at mass consumption and why we're like this, and how sports in particular went everywhere. And Murdoch argued that the growth of modern communication systems in capitalist societies has been inextricably linked to both the rise of mass democracy and the growth of mass consumption. We looked at this at the start of the modernity session, so it's just reinforcing that as capitalism grew, people needed more leisure time because unions agitated for it. We had more of a class system. We had a 5-day working week, but it meant in their leisure time you could sell more and you could produce more for that, and thus it fed into the economy. Who benefits from fan culture? It's just something to think about. So this is the prize draws, the money, and some data for you to kind of look at where is the money going, how is it divided, and who really profits. Bailey looked at sites of inclusion, and this is just something of how we come together as communities. Don't worry, I'll be going over this. This is kind of very heavy theory bits, but we'll be going over this in the session. Bailey's rules found that the 4 sites of inclusion were spatial, which is social inclusion relates to the proximity and the closing of social and economic distances. Relational social inclusion is defined in terms of a sense of belonging and acceptance. Functional social inclusion relates to the enhancement of knowledge, skills and understanding. And 4 power social inclusion assumes a change in the locus of control. We are connected by games, as Mary found, because they represent powerful invocations of the lived world in a playable form, which offer insights into the core fears, fantasies, hopes and anxieties of the given culture in a specific context. That's why we come together over it with place and space. Games are potential sites for negotiating unresolved cultural, social or political frictions, or at least providing powerful, indeed political text to be thought with in order to develop a more nuanced relationship to mass culture and its effects. So we're going to be looking at the idea that they're locations for dreams and fears, because Mary found that to play video games is to engage with the myths of a constituency whose access, agency and ability to wield the technology allows them to communicate their wishes, fears and dreams and even identity politics through a form of interactive entertainment. And it's through this representation that we can decorate spaces and show our pride, such as the Overwatch pride icons. And that is how we express ourselves within a social hierarchy, which is provided for us by the game dev tools. This is a task that we're going to look at, which is to choose video game and look at whether it represents diverse identities in any way. Does it do this through game characters? How many are there? Does the game provide icons or trophies for diversity? Discuss in the method of inclusion you looked. Is it successful? I'm going to leave this up on the screen for a couple of minutes because I need to fill up my water because my throat is dying. And this is a task that you'll be looking at, so I will promise I will be right back. I apologise for this empty chair moment, but because I record through Teams, I don't have a pause button, which is unfortunate, and I still don't have my work laptop, so I can't download other software yet to record. So I apologise for that, but hopefully you've had a good look now. We're going to be looking at marginalisation and how that has related to specific identities, such as queer identities, in the 1986 Games, which is an inclusive event that allowed genders to compete against one another. Yet, despite it being a sporting event, it was largely ignored within journalism related to lifestyle news. So it's to think about if sites of inclusion and how we made them really inclusive, how they're reported. We looked at promotion methods and how we use that. So it's about if we're trying to promote something, what's the positive negatives, and what kind of things can we work with to make sure that it takes off in the right way. And it's also reflected upon that games and esports are not always places of social inclusion, or at least historically haven't been. Video games have been a contested space, usually dominated by ideas of masculinity, and while sports often cater to toxic masculinity, games and esports become spaces of nerd masculinity, or where outcasts could feel connected. This created an us versus them mentality and replicated the same hostilities marginalised people face from wider society. I'm going to be looking at this Hearthstone investigation, which I want you to read about during the session. So there's not so much of a need to now, but if you want to take a look at it in advance, you can, but it's on this idea of who is a real gamer and the hierarchies within the gaming world. Which is partly Darwin et al. Looked at a study which took the form of interviews with players from England, USA and Canada women's football, and found that there were immense gender barriers to women in sports and esports as well, and other areas of the esports industry. They conclude that esports was a sexist and hostile environment for women, and it was plagued by harassment. The study was paralleled with football at the same time, and esports, and it was found that esports was bad, so was football, and there was massive opportunities, and there was actually a law case to try and get access to better football, but there was no such law case with esports because esports was very overlooked. And so if something's overlooked, it's harder to fight those marginalizations because you don't always get the same legal protections. You found that et al. Found that et al. Just simply, if you're new to academia, means that you would have produced this work alongside others. Found that women watch esports for social opportunities and interest in the esports athletes, whereas men watch esports for entertainment, enjoyed watching the aggression. These are very general, broad terms which you are free to debate on whether this study itself is replicating sexism. This again is what I'm talking about with one of the there's sometimes if conventional sports, there's been legal cases to try and fight for better access. In this case, there's baseball and softball. Mesner in 2007 found this, and that there was legal action taken against the school to get better access. Again, esports didn't have that prominent attention, so if there was found to be harassment, it was much harder to get retribution for that, and it's much harder to get equal access because who sues and where does the money come from? Racism in esports, which is something that we'll be discussing quite a lot in future sessions. It's an important marginalisation. We'll be looking at the case of Terence Miller, and during his chat box during a stream, he was faced with abuse, not too dissimilar to what footballers go through when they miss penalties, such as Saka. I remember receiving a lot of racist abuse. And studies have found that non-white players, sorry. Oh, it's actually showing up for a red line now. Are coded as deviant from the players. Deviant meaning that they break society norms in some way. A lot of racism in esports stems from the myth that black people aren't gamers. Gray said that this is a dangerous myth to disseminate because video games have the power to deploy stereotypical imagery. We're producing images all the time. Do they enforce stereotypes or not? And it also has the power to enforce hegemonic ideologies, and virtual gaming communities have adopted these same exclusionary practices. So what we see, we repeat, and that is how we learn. And this is where the danger of bad and poor representation comes from. Esports has also been linked to national identity. There's been large-scale immigration and settlements from former colonies, which has meant a shake-up of Western demographics, which is an ongoing thing due to climate change as well. We will have a migrant crisis in terms of people having to flee their homes, and we will have this as an ongoing situation for many years to come. Murdoch said in 1992, though, that in this new situation, mental scaffolding supporting traditional cultural formations identities is rendered as increasingly precarious and unstable, meaning that we try and cling on to national identities even though they crumble away, and questions how smart it is to do that. We have found, though, that cultural diversity has a positive effect on creativity, which is fantastic, and that mixed gender teams have a positive effect on performance. Diversity is backed up in studies, particularly with esports, as being something that is a positive and gets better performance. Again, what we're going to be looking at is what marginalises the individual player, which is toxic behaviour generally, a constant barrier that other players face. Toxic gaming can consist of spamming the chat, sending abusive or hostile messages, digital sexual assaults such as teabagging. And these are some questions that we will discuss together, which is why do people behave this way, particularly to their teammates? And would this be a barrier to marginalise gamers? If you're already on the periphery of games, how welcome are you going to feel? We'll look at the specific case study of Overwatch abuse and what is being done within Overwatch. The lead designer of Overwatch in 2020 said that we want to make new maps, new heroes, new animated shorts, but bad behaviour is making the game progress in terms of development at a much slower pace. Who's responsible? Is it the developers? Is it the gamers? Is there a middle ground? Devs can design better systems. We're going to look at how publishers and developers can design systems that are better at filtering out abuse. And some examples of things that they can do: quicker bans, easier to report, and hire more staff for moderation and live services support. We'll be looking at the example of Facebook and their moderation team and why this has kind of fallen apart. Gonna have a video to watch about is abuse endemic in esports, but obviously if you want to watch it in advance, please feel free to do so. Going to look at some positive change, though it's not all bad. In 2018, a coalition of 90+ game devs companies started the Fair Play Alliance, a space to share collaborative research and ideas for limiting disruptive behaviour. So there are initiatives taking place which are trying to change gamer behaviour and toxicity. This is one of our final discussions, what we'll be having, which is, can games be considered a marginalised hobby in the 21st century? Has the position of games and their social status changed in recent years? Can gamers be considered a singular homogenous group? Hegemonous, sorry. To what extent do gamers marginalise each other and their own communities? And again, I'll leave that up for a few seconds so you can have a look. Perfect. That's the end. This I kind of whizzed through it a little bit, so it's very well we'll come to the hour mark. But there is quite a lot of more theory. You'll be noticing a step up with theory that we've had in recent weeks. This is to prepare you for your presentations, but it's also so that you get a good oversight of basically the current media landscape and game discussions, and also you get used to referencing a little bit more. This for me is quite an interesting week. I quite like the topic and I'm looking forward to the discussions. I'll be uploading more stuff online, so please keep an eye out over the weeks because I am filming this a bit in advance. But thank you for watching. If you have questions, please prepare them for either the session or please message me on Teams. You will have my Teams now. And of course, if not, Stephanie_Farnsworth at sunderland.ac.uk. Thank you very much. I'll turn off the recording soon. Yeah, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, really.